Explainer 12, the painful twins. Hi, John Rothfield with Derivative Logic. The US debt problem is so large that even the bond market vigilantes that we used to talk about have shrugged and left the building. Let's start with the balance sheet of the United States. By the end of fiscal 2025, the federal government had a net liability position of $42 trillion. That's trillion. It's more than doubled in 10 years from $18 trillion in 2015. And that's not counting unfunded social insurance obligations, Social Security and Medicare, which now stand at $88 trillion from $27 trillion a decade earlier. Meanwhile, the US net liability position with the rest of the world sat at $28 trillion in the same quarter, up from $28 trillion prior to two Trumps and a Biden. Aside from the numerical similarity, how are these related? After all, one is a government debt liability, the other a national liability, including equity to the rest of the world. My entry point into this is a quarterly Federal Reserve report entitled The Financial Accounts of the United States, otherwise known by economists as the Flow of Funds Report. Flow of Funds asserts that there are three domestic players in the US economy. They are households, non-financial businesses, and the government. You'll notice that banks stand outside of this framework. They are the intermediaries. When you add up the net borrowing and lending by these three entities, and the result is a shortfall, definitionally, that shortfall has to be funded from the rest of the world. This shortfall was close to zero, believe it or not, in 1990, but has since gone pear-shaped. Here's how the flows panned out in 2025, for example. There was a government shortfall of $2.3 trillion. Between them, households and businesses had just $850 billion in net savings. This resulted in a net shortfall of around $1.4 trillion. On the external side, the current account deficit was around $1.1 trillion, a pretty close match. These numbers, by the way, are a little different to where they were in 2023 and 2024. The US having $1 trillion a year offshore funding requirement may not be as alarming as it sounds if one were to posit that the driver of these liability accumulations are basically foreigners wanting to invest in the US growth story. A story that from the early 2010s perpetrated a 50% rise in the value of the dollar. But each year it is this incremental requirement for foreigners to absorb more dollar assets that one worries about. This has been made more tenuous by rising bond yields in countries like Japan and Germany, which have essentially made US treasuries less competitive. Please let us know if you have other topics that we should be covering in our Explainer series.